Although they had lived together for almost 40 years now, it still didn't seem as though they really had a relationship. For instance, Mr. Dawson had always enjoyed reading the newspaper out loud, and after Mrs. Dawson, with whom he certainly did have a relationship, had expressed her determined lack of interest in hearing it, he had transferred his attention to Helmut, who did enjoy being read to and took a great interest in what was going on in the world. Unfortunately, Helmut was unable to convey this enthusiasm to Mr. Dawson. It was one of the many drawbacks of being a tortoise. Helmut had already lived in the garden shed for many years. He wasn't exactly sure how many, prior to the Dawsons taking possession of their first and only home. Mr. Dawson had considered returning the creature to Mr. and Mrs. Doolan, the former owners of the property, but had then remembered that they had been planning to emigrate to Australia for the princely sum of £10, he believed, and he felt it would be inhumane to inflict transportation on a guiltless, if inconvenient, tortoise. Mrs. Dawson had tolerated it on the strict understanding that she would have nothing whatsoever to do with it. So it was left to Mr. Dawson to feed it, which was apparently all that was required. Once their daughter Amy was old enough, at the relatively tender age of 6, she took over even those modest duties. Mrs. Dawson had heard that tortoises lived to be a great age, and she wondered how one went about estimating that sort of thing, looking at the teeth perhaps, or the pattern on its shell. She was also highly suspicious of the choice of name, which had been painted in white gloss paint on its shell at some point long ago, but was still just decipherable. "Sounds a bit German to me," she had said, with a face that looked as though she had bitten into a chocolate expecting to find a nutty centre, but discovered a very disappointing orange cream. "You will be thinking of the former German Chancellor, Herr Kohl," suggested Mr. Dawson, in a political allusion that merely served to confuse his wife further. The newspaper was generally delivered between 8 and 8:30 each morning, except if there had been snow, when it was either late or didn't arrive at all. Mrs. Dawson habitually woke up at 8:15 and took her breakfast in bed around 8:30. Mrs. Dawson took all her meals in bed. Breakfast consisted of 4 slices of toast, made with thick-cut white sliced, 2 spread with Marmite and 2 with Robinson's Golden Shred marmalade, and a large mug of tea. In between Marmite and marmalade, Mrs. Dawson switched on her television set, which lived on the chest of drawers at the end of the bed. If she wasn't interested in whatever Richard or Julie were offering at the moment, she would mute the sound and switch to 5 Live radio. This was her alternating routine throughout the day. TV, radio, TV, radio. What she particularly loved was a phone-in, even tuning in to talk sport on occasions. Much to Mr. Dawson's irritation, she frequently referred to the presenters on the radio and television as her family and friends. He refused to point out the obvious, that she actually had family, even if she no longer had many friends. Amy Dawson was now 27, very unmarried, worked in a rather grubby local insurance office, and visited her parents twice a week, on Tuesdays and Sundays usually. She spent half an hour sitting awkwardly beside her bedridden mother, desperately and often unsuccessfully trying to think of what to talk about, then a couple more hours with Mr. Dawson discussing the state of the world, before returning to the sick room for a final 10-minute stint. Those 2 hours were the highlights of Mr. Dawson's week. It was in fact Amy that suggested the idea of a dog. The Dawsons had never had a dog. They weren't really dog people. Anyway, they already had Helmut, and 2 pets seemed somehow rather excessive. Looking after Mrs. Dawson, or waiting on her ladyship hand, foot and finger, as he referred to it, strictly to himself, took up much of Mr. Dawson's time. After breakfast came lunch, or dinner as Mrs. Dawson insisted on calling it, which alternated between the Sainsbury's meal for 1 and the Heinz big soup with a small buttered baguette, followed by tin fruit of some description with custard or ice cream, while Mr. Dawson usually had a pork pie or a pasty or something of that nature, with a large bag of cheese and onion crisps and a bottle of light ale. Tea, or supper, as Mr. Dawson preferred to say, was always something on toast. Beans, scrambled egg, sardines, or if there had been a problem with the shopping, sometimes just Marmite again. This was taken at 5 o'clock. Mr. Dawson's final trip up to his wife's bedroom was with her 10 o'clock milky hot chocolate and a Kit Kat, the 4-finger version. Except for these visits, the couple did not see much of each other, unless there were emergencies, which usually happened about 3 or 4 times a week and were never really emergencies anyway. "A dog would be a bit of company for you, Dad," Amy had said as she pulled on her anorak to leave. Mr. Dawson agreed to think about it, even though he really had no intention of doing so. However, the following morning, after reading the paper to Helmut, and somewhat against his better judgment, he decided to discuss the dog suggestion with his tortoise. But despite Helmut having extremely strong views on the matter, Mr. Dawson's mind was no clearer afterwards. When Amy arrived on the Sunday, she presented her father with the address of the local dog rescue service, insisting that a companion would be just the ticket for him. It has to be said that Helmut was distinctly unhappy when 2 days later Mr. Dawson explained to him why the reading of the newspaper would have to be postponed until that afternoon, as he was visiting the dog's home, as he called it. Helmut didn't know whether to be alarmed or angry. Neither was a natural emotion for a tortoise. On his initial visit, Mr. Dawson was only allowed to look at the dogs, to see if there were any that took his fancy, and to discuss the responsibilities of dog ownership, and that sort of thing. Most of them were far too big. He could see that straight away. He certainly didn't want a big dog, not an Alsatian or a setter or anything like that. He thought something like a Jack Russell might suit him, that sort of size anyway. The girl at the dog's home was polite but really rather intimidating. He wondered if she might be one of those lady rugby players that you see in the newspapers occasionally. You certainly wouldn't want to argue with her. Mr. Dawson had imagined that he would be able to just go down to the compound, pick a dog out and take it home, but it wasn't like that at all. There were countless questions to answer and forms to fill in. You would have thought he was adopting a child of the aristocracy rather than a dog. In his favour, he stressed he didn't mind taking an old dog, which seemed to go down well with the girl. And he certainly wasn't worried if it was a mongrel. He'd heard they were less problematic in general. On his second visit, he spotted a little ginger dog that quite appealed to him. The girl thought it was probably about 7 or 8, and it seemed to have a quiet nature, which pleased Mr. Dawson. So after all the necessary paperwork had been completed, he popped the little chap into the back of his car and headed for home. When he took up Mrs. Dawson's Sainsbury's lunch, Mr. Dawson mentioned the dog for the first time. He hadn't wanted to get into an argument about it, so was delighted when his wife didn't seem to be bothered one way or another. "Just so long as it doesn't come up here," she said. "So what's it called?" "I thought I'd call him Ginger," Mr. Dawson said. Of course, it was too much to hope that Ginger and Helmet would be friends. They didn't really have much in common, except Mr. Dawson, of course. Whilst Ginger thought of Helmet as ancient, which he certainly was, and stupid, which he most certainly was not, Helmet considered Ginger to be intrusive, manipulative, and quite possibly flea-ridden. However, they kept their views to themselves, and a sort of uneasy truce was established, with the garden shed the undisputed territory of the tortoise, and the rug in front of the sitting-room fire the dog's domain. Flushed with the excitement of trying new things, Mr. Dawson decided that he would take up smoking a pipe. It was clearly a very unfashionable thing to do, which only added to its appeal, and the whole ritual of loading and lighting, and then constantly having to relight, and then the delight of cleaning out and preparing the bowl for the next pipeful, was simply a joy to him. Not so to Mrs. Dawson, for whom the upward drifting smoke presented a cause for the utmost concern. "If you must engage in these filthy habits," she declared, "you will do so in the garden shed. Do I make myself clear, Mr. Dawson?" Mr. Dawson wilted and conceded. Ginger had displayed a disappointing lack of interest in listening to the newspaper being read to him, so Mr. Dawson continued to recite the news to his tortoise, with the additional delight, from Helmet's point of view, of the atmosphere in the shed now sweetly scented with rich tobacco. And so things remained in the Dawson household much as they had been before, but with the novel canine addition. Mrs. Dawson neither improved nor deteriorated, and showed no signs of dissatisfaction with the domestic arrangements. The doctor visited her on a monthly basis, prescribed the same remedies, and suggested rather unhelpfully that time would tell, with which it was impossible to disagree. On the afternoon of the third Wednesday of each month, Joyce, from the Heads Up hairdressers on the estate, would come to do Mrs. Dawson's hair, and leave with only the faintest blue tinge to show for her efforts. Mr. Dawson always felt obliged to offer her a cup of tea, and the enthusiasm with which she invariably replied, "Oh, go on then, if you must," suggested to him that the hairdresser had a bit of a soft spot for him. He was careful never to offer her a second cup, lest she misinterpret his motives. Ginger settled in seamlessly, and despite the tentative relationship between the dog and the tortoise, all remained calm for a number of years, until one evening something took place to shatter that happy state and threw Mr. Dawson into a mental turmoil from which he thought he might never recover. Supper dispensed, sardines on toast, Mr. Dawson sat down in front of his own slightly superior television set to watch a football match, with Ginger happily curled up in front of the unlit fire. As the game kicked off, Ginger sat up and repositioned himself with his back against the settee in order to watch the match. This was something that Mr. Dawson had noticed on several previous occasions, especially, it seemed, when Tottenham Hotspur were playing. Tonight, the Spurs were pitted against Mr. Dawson's own Crystal Palace in a cup quarter-final. It had been a tense encounter, with neither side ever really gaining the upper hand. And with just 5 minutes to play, Palace centre-forward was brought down in the Spurs box. The home crowd erupted in a chorus of "Penalty, ref!" At which point, to Mr. Dawson's utter astonishment, Ginger leapt at the screen and shouted, "No way, ref! He dived!" Of course, Ginger knew at once what he had done. It was a disaster, a catastrophe, a breaking of the most solemn of all the animal vows. He had spoken human. Mr. Dawson sat in his seat, rigid with fear, whilst Ginger slunk onto his mat, his tail so far between his legs that it disappeared altogether, and his front paw placed on top of his head in a firm act of contrition. And there they remained. The penalty was missed, and the game drifted into extra time without man or dog even noticing. When he eventually returned to his senses, Mr. Dawson tried to persuade himself that he had misheard, but in truth he knew he had not. And now the genie was out of the bottle, and nothing would ever be the same again. Time went on. Mrs. Dawson went on. Joyce's cups of tea went on. Helmet added a few more years to his grand total, and Ginger tried to pretend that nothing had happened, but of course there was no escaping what he had done. Word got out somehow. It might have been an insect or a moth that had been in the room at the time that started it off, but soon it was common knowledge locally, and once the birds had got hold of the story, there was no stopping it. Poor Ginger faced the situation stoically, knowing that he would be shunned wherever he went. Even Mr. Dawson could hardly bring himself to look at the dog for fear of reviving that terrible moment. It was only Helmet who showed the poor beast any charity. Helmet, who had once been so antagonistic in his attitude towards Ginger, now became his only friend. Ginger, despite Helmet's best efforts, went into a slow decline. His fur turned grey, his limbs stiffened, and his heart faltered. It was a silly habit of Mr. Dawson's, he knew, but it was one that he still kept up. He always left a ginger biscuit on the dog's bed before he retired for the night, and unsurprisingly, it would be gone in the morning. So when, on a sunny April morning, Mr. Dawson came down the stairs to see the dog curled up in his basket, with the ginger biscuit still untouched, he knew it was over. Later that morning, when he went out to the shed to read Helmet the newspaper, he gave the tortoise the sad news. And when he had pondered for a while, the ancient creature, in a soft, husky voice that he trusted Mr. Dawson wouldn't hear, whispered, "Cheerio, Ginger."